Carl Thomas is a man of many hats. He's been a top C-suite growth executive, the executive producer of over 25 televised triathlon and sporting events, and has served as a pioneer in the triathlon community. Carl has been speaking in various professional capacities for well over 3 decades. Today, he joins us to talk about the changing world of sports in the wake of COVID-19. Carl, thanks for rejoining us today.
My pleasure, Sarah, as always.
Where has the sports industry been hit the hardest in the rise of COVID-19?
Well, let's first start with the size of the global sport marketplace. It is an annualized business in excess of $150 billion, and it's grown year over year for the last 4 decades. So sport, as we know it across the globe, is huge and growing. But clearly the largest impact has been in the live event space. Leagues, teams, games, matches, events, and the revenue loss there is massive. No game, no ticket sales, no parking revenue, no food, no beverage, no merchandise, and no experience for the fans, which is exactly why the sponsors and advertisers buy into sport at every level. So the long-term implications, TBD. Season-long implications right now, the media carriage rights, the sponsorship dollars and cents that have already been invested, and that in the hopes of teams, leagues, and federations will continue to be invested, and then the potential fan loss.
How are different sports leagues and federations handling the cancellation of their seasons?
Well, that's a really good question. And actually, it depends on the league and federation. Like, some have canceled. Most have postponed, hoping for an early end of the lockdown. 2 major global events that were scheduled for this summer, the 2020 Olympic Games in Tokyo, has been postponed and rescheduled for exactly 1 year down the road from its initial launch date, July of 2021. And the European Soccer Championships, which is the second largest revenue generating and audience generated soccer tournament on the planet, only behind the World Cup and in front of the Olympic soccer tournament, was scheduled this summer. And it's really unclear at the moment what UEFA, which is a European governing body, is going to do about that. But it's a really interesting and a question with sort of many tentacles to it. For example, at the major league or premiership level around the world, call it Major League Baseball, the NBA, premiership football in the UK, the Bundesliga in Germany, all of those leagues and down to the match have massive media carriage and distribution rights deals. So it's quite conceivable that once this lockdown is lifted, that these games or some of these games could actually be played in empty stadiums. That ultimately goes down to the local level, what a national government might decree or a league might decree. You know, the city of Munich might not buy in, or the city of Boston might not buy in. But if you sort of think about it, and you think about a classic rivalry like the Boston Red Sox versus the New York Yankees, and if you were to stage a game in an empty Fenway Park, and you did your job in terms of production in a virtual way, so you piped in music, you piped in crowd noise, you had the play-by-play announcers doing the live broadcast, not necessarily remotely, but in different parts of the stadium, so social distancing was obviously still in force. It could be quite an interesting exercise, and it's possible, I mean, we could never predict this, but it's possible that that game in and of itself could deliver a massive live television audience for a couple of reasons. One, the pent-up frustration and demand of baseball fans across the United States. Secondly, sort of the unique / potentially eerie game being played in a dead empty stadium with all of the virtual delivery of ambient noise, crowd noise, music, the Cracker Jack man and the Peanut Man and the Beer Man and all those kinds of things. So it's a really interesting thing to think about, but that is only true at the elite levels of professional sport. As it trickles down to a huge volume of sport that is minor league baseball or USL soccer or the D League in the NBA, where small or no media rights packages exist, that's really not possible. Because without the fans, without that, fan-driven sales volume of merchandise and food and beverage and parking and those sorts of things, it just wouldn't work. It's also doesn't work where very significant global participant events have had to be canceled or postponed, like the Boston Marathon, like the Ironman World Championships, like a number of events that in and of themselves are very significant, draw thousands and thousands of participants, and also have video delivery, live delivery over the web and streaming networks. Really impossible for those events to take place. So the hope is, and many of these events have postponed and already established dates certain in late summer and early fall, hoping that this will end and be in sort of commerce and social togetherness, for lack of a better term, can resume.
In lieu of the option of watching live games, people are turning elsewhere for entertainment. When quarantine ends, do you think this will ultimately result in lost fans or revenue?
Well, I mean, the initial sort of knee-jerk reaction is, sure, how couldn't it, or why wouldn't it? But if you take a step back, I think a couple of things. Certainly, there will be lost near-term revenue. You can never replace that fan-driven game day revenue. Once the game isn't played, that revenue is lost. From a broader perspective, television rights, sponsorship, my guess is that for the most part, those agreements stay in place. They probably get extended on the back end of a contract term without penalty, so that ultimately the delivery of the benefit to media rights holders and or sponsors and or advertisers would ultimately be made good over time. But for example, in today's viewing spectrum, classic iconic events, classic iconic matches, or Tigers golf championship win of a year ago, those will get replayed and replayed. They will get streamed. They will get played on their native networks, be it the Golf Channel or ESPN Classic. The Olympic Channel is a great example. They have archived content that goes back 20, 30, 40 years. And they could always, and are at the moment, resurfacing, especially now that this was given an Olympic year. They're resurfacing that content and drawing audiences to the classic Olympic events. The interesting part to that is, I think, that classic content will only resonate and draw audiences for so long. So then what? Well, the then what is really where creative capabilities come to the fore. There are a couple of examples underway right now where in the UK, for example, they did a virtual Grand National Horse Race Championship, gamified it and tethered it to COVID-19 charities, and raised in excess of £3 million on the occasion of that event. So there are very interesting and cool ways, but it takes a really creative, innovative approach, and that's what that's what these executives get paid to do. In terms of fan loss, that's really a huge question. I could argue that, both ways. One, when play resumes, I think the first ones back are the diehards. The casual fan probably comes back a little more slowly for a lot of reasons. The closest thing that here in the U.S. we have to a complete shutdown harkens back to the years when major leagues went on strike. And I mean, if you go back 30 years, you can see when the NFL went on strike and they used replacement players, and the NBA went on strike, and the National Hockey League went out for the better part of 2 years. And in those cases, there was a lot of animus that was built up by the fan base. They were mad at the leagues, they were mad at the teams, they were mad at the players, and so they held a grudge. And the sort of comeback of fans post-strike was slow and long and arduous because there was a fundamental underlying reason. Absolutely not the case right now. This was nobody's fault. So there's no grudges being held here. In fact, I think just the opposite. This pent-up demand and frustration will come back in force, but it's really too early to tell. And we just have to sort of wait and see how it all plays out.
What changes have you already seen in how we're consuming sports media?
Well, I just mentioned one of the interesting, more fun changes. Esports is coming to the fore right now. A lot of major properties, Formula One, Formula E, in motor racing, and others are really leveraging up their esports properties because these can be consumed and played in the confines of your own home or your own studio. So those kinds of things are actually gaining traction. But at the end of the day, this was already underway. Over-the-top television, OTT networks, many of the major league clubs around the world in American football, in European football, in baseball have their own over-the-top network. So a Chelsea fan that consumes Chelsea content who might reside in South America or Asia or North America is still a Chelsea fan. So these tools and platforms, OTT, video on demand, ESPN Plus, the Red Zone, we're all familiar with, Disney Plus coming online, Peacock, which is the NBC offering, coming online soon, all have either been doing already what they're doing, or it's accelerating the eventuation of these networks. And sport media consumption across the board is pretty much tracking the same way that mainstream media consumption is, but there's one huge difference, and it's to the huge benefit of sport. All of the elements we talked earlier about, leagues, teams, federations, events, fans, sponsors, media platforms, across the world, sport is pretty much impervious to socioeconomic proclivities, language differences, cultural biases, etc. And this just lends huge credence to the delivery of content via, if you will, new media means. And the given that sport, along with music, I mean, I think there are two really global international languages that cross all boundaries, regardless of whether it's geography or language or socioeconomic or political or whatever. Music and sports sort of, occupy that space. And it's quite different than, the more generic country by country or specific news feeds or specific entertainment platforms. So I think this is ultimately going to be a huge benefit to sport over time. It will get fans, advertisers, sponsors, and leagues and teams very familiar with best practices, what works, what doesn't, and it will allow them to up their game and accelerate the quality and quantity of the delivery of the sporting content.
What long-term changes do you think we can expect to see as a result of this spring?
Well, that's the $150 billion question in the case of sport, because truly it's too early to tell. But, going to the ballpark or the soccer pitch or queuing up at the start line of the Boston Marathon, or going to the mall or the movie theater or the concert venue. There will be, for some period of time, social distancing in some form or manner. What that really looks like, it's almost impossible to tell. But at this moment in time, as we are capturing this content and doing this interview, the daily change and the forecasting and the models of how COVID-19 is impacting populations, both from a catching or contracting the virus rate to the unfortunate demise of folks who have caught it and succumbed to it. Those models are changing almost hourly, let alone daily or weekly. So we're in a real-time environment, and trying to forecast it is I think, folly. What I do think is media consumption will permanently change. And that means noticeable and in some cases very dramatic acceleration of platforms and delivery systems, more easily and available accessibility, bandwidth and Wi-Fi speeds improving and growing. All of that is an absolute necessity in this time. And once those networks and platforms and delivery systems and accessibility elements are in place, they won't change. So in a certain way, the necessity is always the mother of invention, right? So in this particular case, the necessity of the acceleration of all of these tools and platforms is going to be, I think, a huge benefit over time. And we've got new players coming to the market almost every day. I mentioned Peacock. Everybody's probably aware that Quibi launched this past week. Their first day subscriber base was over 1 million. It paled in comparison to the launch of Disney Plus, but let's be real. Disney is a 80 or 90-year-old iconic brand, and launched with the muscle and marketing power that is rare on this planet, regardless of the property or benefit or the platform. Quibi is really an interesting thing. They went out with a 90-day free trial. I know a lot of folks who have signed up for that 90-day free trial. I have. I'm already watching a show. But if you take Quibi as an example of the new kid on the block, there probably wasn't a worse time for them to launch. But as they grow, as they scale, and as they add to and augment their delivery of content to news and sports and weather, and become a more full service network platform, and if their subscriber base grows, and if they're successful in converting the 90-day trials to paid subscribers, and if that subscriber base reaches a certain point, then it's quite conceivable that at some point in the not too distant future, that Quibi could come to the table as yet another buyer of live sports content, in the same way that Amazon Prime and Facebook Live have dabbled in it over the past couple of years. I think the days of those, what are now 5 primary networks delivering live sports and paying billions of dollars per year for that right and privilege, is one of the things that will fuel the continued growth of sport, is more players coming in and being able and willing to spend money to get access to unique live sports content.
Well, Carl, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insight today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Sarah. It's very close to my heart. I've been a sports person my entire life, including my entire business career, and it's one of the joys of life, not just for me, but for literally billions of sporting fans globally. This too shall pass.
Thank you, Carl.